Okay, here we go. There we go. All right, let me see if we have any attendees. Right now, the attendees list is at 0. Here we go. Hi, Alex. Welcome. We'll just go ahead and wait a few more minutes while we have a few more attendees join us. Welcome, everybody. We'll just go ahead and wait another minute. And let me just get my notes up in front of me. Here we go. Hi, Danielle.
Hello.
Hi, welcome. All right, we will go ahead and get started right on time. Welcome, everybody. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So this is webinar number 5 in our 6-part Navigating the NDIS series. And this webinar is all about what to do if you're not happy with your plan and how to make sense of the internal reviews process. It may not just be that you're unhappy with your plan, but it also could be that your circumstances have changed for a variety of different reasons, and therefore you need your plan reviewed. So tonight we'll cover the ins and outs of what to do in all of these different situations. Just a reminder that if you drop out of the webinar, you can just sign right back in. There's no password required. If for whatever reason you're having difficulty logging in tonight or with any technology issues, we'll be sending around a link to the recording after the webinar, so everybody will have access to the recording. But before we get started, I just want to introduce our panelists for tonight. First, we have Shannon Eels. Shannon, go ahead and give a wave. Shannon is the Managing Director for Autism Partnership Australia. And in this role, she leads a team of passionate and talented people to achieve the best outcomes for children with autism and their families. And Shannon also in her role plays a key role in working with families to help them navigate the NDIS and secure funding for early intensive intervention. Next, we have Bob Buckley. Bob is a parent advocate and the convener of Autism Asperger's Advocacy Australia, also known as A4. And A4 was formed in response to growing demands from people with autism and their families who wanted more direct involvement in raising the profile of autism-related issues with decision makers, government, and through the media. A4's advocacy gives voice at a national level for individuals and groups involved with autism across Australia. And while helping individuals is not part of his systemic advocacy work, Bob has helped many families to successfully navigate the NDIS. We have Vicky Jones. Vicky is a parent with lived experience of navigating the NDIS. She is passionate about sharing her NDIS journey to help other families access the funding they need for evidence-based intervention. And finally, we have Danielle Baranar. Danielle is an entrepreneur, and she's developed and executed a highly functional website and customer support network called Carista that assesses NDIS participants' needs and matches them to a range of service providers. As experts in the field, the Carista team quickly and accurately identify the best supports to meet the individual's needs. So highly recommend checking out Carista if you're looking to link up with service providers that are uniquely matched to suit your needs. So let's jump right into our first question for tonight. I think I'll start with Bob. What are some of the reasons why a family might request a review of their NDIS plan? And are there any reasons that you can or can't do this?
In my experience, the primary reason, or the reason I guess that we're mostly focused on here, is if you join the NDIS and you get your plan and it doesn't meet your child's needs, or your needs or your child's needs. So too often an NDIS plan for an autistic child really doesn't provide sufficient funding for the early intervention that they need. So generally when you first get your plan, they don't really explain the reasons. They the plan contains some stuff about what they expect you to do and some fairly vague reasons about why they gave you the funding, but they don't usually explain why they didn't give you some of the funding. So the reasons for requesting it is that generally you actually need more support than they've recognised, and it's quite normal for parents of autistic children to have to push fairly hard to get what they need. So the NDIA has a culture that sort of is not really receptive to evidence-based practice. They're not good at reading and understanding the research literature in relation to autism. And their planners are not trained generally to deal with autistic children, unfortunately. We've been pushing for a long time to have planners trained better in autism, to understand autism better, but there's a bit of a challenge because there's not enough people around with the experience. Autism numbers have increased faster than the growth in service providers. So there's a shortage of expertise really in Australia and in most parts of the world, in fact, so we're not unique in that regard. So those are the main reasons, I think.
Yeah, I think, it's worth noting that when sort of, in particular, early intervention was sort of described to the NDIS in terms of what it should look like from several early intervention advocacy groups, it was sort of put forth that the model should be one in which we call that key worker model, one in which there are some allied health specialists who maybe see the child weekly or fortnightly or monthly, and somebody who helps coordinate those services, but that it was really a parent's responsibility to actually deliver the day-to-day intervention for the child. And so because that key worker model was adopted and sort of endorsed, and now families are coming to the NDIS wanting funding for upwards of 20 hours a week of evidence-based and early intervention, that seems to be sort of conflicting with that model that they had sort of decided was best practice and that they were going to fund. So I think maybe that's part of the reason why early on there was maybe more difficulty with getting, the right level of funding for evidence-based early intervention. Shannon, are there other factors that families might consider that might trigger a request for a review of a plan, or anything else that families should consider when, I guess, reviewing their own circumstances and deciding whether or not any sort of change is required?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two main types. One that Bob's, and both of them equate to what Bob was just saying around you don't have enough funding in your plan to access the service that you would like to access, what the evidence suggests is going to give your child the best opportunity, and also what the professionals you're currently working with might be recommending. So sometimes that will happen. Sometimes you'll know the intervention that you want to do before you have your planning meeting, and you'll sort of have an idea in your mind about how much funding you need. And the outcome of that planning meeting is less than what you need. So you could go to one type of review. Another type of review is if something changes in your life, and COVID is a really good example. You find yourself homeschooling or with no informal supports anymore. You can't see family and friends who would usually help out with your other children or with your child with autism. So, or it might be that something is just different. And I think that sometimes kids will go up and down in their, there are patches where everything is going more smoothly, and then there are times where it's not going so smoothly. So it might be one of those times as well, where there's sort of change in your child's circumstance or what's happening for them.
Right. I think that's a key point, is that any change of circumstance that affects how your supports are delivered and the cost of your supports and the intensity of your supports, any of those things are a valid reason to request an internal review of your plan. It's not like there's only, one or two set reasons. And so families, I guess, should just feel empowered that if any point in time something changes for them, it's perfectly fine to request a review. And is it okay? I guess this has come up in a couple with families that I've talked to, like, can families actually spend their funding while they're requesting a review? Or does that mean that all their funding is put on hold?
No, they can spend the funding they have while they're requesting the review. Yep, they can.
Okay.
And quite often, in fact, you can use some of the funding for getting possibly some assessments that you need.
Yeah.
So you don't have to spend your own money to do that. I'd like to emphasize, really, my experience is that the reasons that I think most of the reviews that I've been involved in have really come from the NDIS not actually understanding what the child wants. And so the change of circumstances that you realise that the NDIS hasn't written a good plan. They'd like you to call it a change of circumstance, but the reality is the circumstances haven't really changed. It's just that they didn't understand what the circumstances were in the first place.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
and you can call that a change in circumstance. There's no requirement for a change in circumstance. So the NDIS will make you think that you have to have a change in circumstance to have a review. That's not true at all.
Okay.
Okay. And even though the form that you requested on is often called a change in circumstance form, the change in circumstances that you want to review, that's a change in circumstance.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I'd sort of not get too fussed about the change in circumstance, would be my advice. What it is that the needs are not being met and you want them to be met. So that's the change that you're looking for.
That's a good point. And I think the important thing to note is that if a family receives a plan where they're worried that they don't have enough funding to last them, let's say, a full 12 months of services and support, they can start spending their funding while they request that review so that they can get additional information that might help make their case as to why they need additional funding. And yes, your funding might run out in 6 months, but the plan is that you will have a new plan by then with that additional funding that you need.
And you can access services that work for your child and demonstrate that it works, which makes the argument for more funding more compelling.
Exactly.
So if you use the money to get services that actually work, it's a much more compelling argument.
To continue those services. Yeah. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this already, Bob, but is there sort of any rules or regulations around when a family can request a review? And exactly what do you do when you want to make a request for a review? What are the steps that a family should follow?
This is a tricky one because I think people interpret the law differently. Even the lawyers and the NDIS interpret it differently. But from my perspective, Section 48 of the NDIS law says in relation to plans, so if we're talking primarily about plans here, that Section 48 is about reviewing plans. And it says you can request a plan review at any time, right? So it doesn't say you have to have a reason. It doesn't say you have to have change in circumstance, nothing. It just says you can request a plan review at any time. And it sort of says, well, if they decide not to review, then you can have that decision reviewed as well. You'll hear, if you talk to advocates and to lawyers about this, they talk about Section 100 reviews and they talk about Section 48 reviews. But the AAT doesn't do that, or the process doesn't really think about that very much. The law says that you can request a review at any time. but you need to ask yourself why you need to ask for a review, and that is because either, you know, something hasn't been understood, something's been disregarded. So I always say to people, before you do a review, before you request a review, have a look at your goals and see if they're saying clearly what you need them to say, because they're the things that determine what the plan is going to be. So I tell people at every step, review your goals. The law says you can change your goals at any time. And if your goals change, then if they change in any significant way, it probably means that you need a review to review your new goals anyway.
Yeah.
So you sort of have to ask, have my goals been understood by the NDIS, right? It's not whether they're good goals,
right?
Whether they've communicated what your child needs to the NDIS, okay?
Gotcha.
And you can write a number of, there's no limit on the number of goals and things, so you know you've got a lot of freedom there. The main thing is to say, this is what my child needs now and this is what they're going to need in the future. I want a plan, I want a review that's going to deliver me a plan that meets those goals, that it meets the short-term goals and that's heading towards meeting the medium-term goals, and that it covers the things that are in my long-term goals, okay?
Right.
So it's really, Section 48 says you can ask for a plan review at any time. I mean, Section 100 talks about a whole bunch of other sorts of decisions, but here we're focused on plan reviews.
Gotcha.
So my emphasis would be to look at Section 48.
Okay.
Once you get a review, you get 3 months in which to say, am I satisfied with that? If I'm not, I then go on to the next stage. So that's where the time limit comes in. Once you've had that initial review, you've got 3 months to sort of sort out whether you've got a successful review or whether you need to be thinking about moving on to the next thing, which I think we talk about in the next webinar.
Yeah, yeah. Now, if a family wants to actually request a review, do they just go onto the NDIS's website and there's a form that they have to fill out and submit?
Because you're dealing with people with disabilities, the NDIS is completely flexible about this.
Okay.
I mean, it says you can call them up on the phone and ask for it. But my advice to people is to always put it in an email, put your request in an email so that you have a record. Okay. So that if you have a record of when you send it, you can look it up at any time. And they should respond to you to say, yes, we've received your request. But you can also call them up and check that they've received it, or you can call them up and say, I'm going to send you one. You can do multiple means of communication if you want to. I believe there's a form on the website called a change of circumstance form. You can fill that in if you like. It's probably a good guide of the information that they need. So you fill it in saying, I want a request. You don't really have to justify the change of circumstance bit. But as I said, you can always say, the fact that I now want a review is a change of circumstance.
Right, right.
So,
we have a loose interpretation of their wording. Okay, good. Shannon, can you give us any insight as to what happens once a request is made? What does the NDIS then do with that request?
Sure. Yeah, and this differs from time to time. I think we go through themes of what the NDIA are currently doing. So I'll talk about what they're currently doing.
Okay.
So the two different types of reviews, the Section 100 review, at the moment you would, so that's a review of a decision. So the original planning outcome, you're basically asking somebody else from the NDIA to look at the information that you gave them and decide whether that original person made the right decision on the plan outcome. This, and then, so for that one, which has to be done within 3 months of your plan outcome date, you submit a request, which can just be an email, like Bob said, and then you basically wait. And I would be calling them pretty soon. I'd probably give them a couple of weeks. At the moment, we're seeing an average outcome time of about 2 months before you hear anything. And that tends to be for people who are sort of moderately advocating, I think, that might be calling once a week, not sort of every day. You can expedite that sometimes, which I'm happy to chat about, but essentially you are waiting for someone else to look at that and decide whether the right decision was made. It used to be that the reviewer would contact you. So this time last year, a little bit earlier, the reviewer would contact you and actually ask for more information. They don't seem to be doing that now. They seem to just be going off of the information that they already have. I think that's strategic. And then you're just getting a written outcome, or the planner, the reviewer is calling you and saying, I'll have an outcome for you by Friday. We're missing this report. Can you upload it again for me, or something like that? But you don't have a lot of opportunity to provide more information at the moment. That's just in the last couple of months, that's changed a bit.
Okay.
So then you'll get your outcome. If it's a Section 48 review, which is the change of circumstance one, like Bob said, anything can be a change of circumstance, but they will sometimes say no, that you don't have a genuine change of circumstance. So that you also can fight in another way. But at the moment, and they're also required to tell you, once you submit your request for change of circumstance review, which is basically asking to move your planning meeting forward, they have 2 weeks to tell you whether or not they're going to do that, 14 days. I've heard all kinds of crazy things in the last week and a half. Now it's changed to 21, or we didn't get your email until 2 weeks after you sent it, so now it'll be 14 days from now. And that's not what the legislation says. So firstly, if you're going to submit a Section 48, or any review, and you don't get a response back to say they've received it, I'd follow up to make sure that you get a response back. And then they have 14 days to give you an outcome of whether they're going to do the review or not. And if they say, yes, we agree, there's been a change of circumstance, and we're going to do the review, then go back into planning again.
Gotcha.
And go through another planning meeting, which they're also dragging that out. The general message, I think, is don't be very patient. At the moment, from sort of request for Section 48 to getting funding, probably about 10 weeks at the moment, we're seeing, if you just kind of sort of wait. You're kind of following them up, but again, you can expedite these things if you are, the squeaky wheel absolutely works. I mean, I have many parents who'll say to me, we don't want to rock the boat, we don't want to get anyone offside. That never works. I've never, ever seen advocating go against a parent or a child ever. It's always the people who are yelling the loudest the most. It's the only thing that we see make a predictable difference. So that would be the calling, I think, and following up. The other thing that is helpful when you're submitting a review is if you have some kind of complaint to go along with it. So we recently had a situation where we had a family who did a Freedom of Information request to get everything that was on their child's file, and there was information in that the parent actually hadn't given the planner. So there was a Pedicat score, they hadn't done another Pedicat. There was some misinformation about who that child lived with. And so in her review request, that parent listed all those things that were wrong, and she got a very rapid, like within 3 days, a reviewer was calling her. So there are things you can do, I guess, to speed it up a little bit.
Wow. How long does it take, or how long did it take in that case for the family to get the information from when they requested an FOI?
So the FOI, not more, they're required also to tell you whether they're going to give you that a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks. Yeah,
okay.
Not very long at all.
The law on FOI says they have to respond in 30 days.
Okay.
But there's a provision in the law that they can ask for a short extension.
Yeah.
Which, if they ask, you have to give it. I mean, they're going to take it anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know why they bother to ask. They should just write to you and say, we're taking longer. But it should only be 2 or 3 weeks longer.
Okay, gotcha.
After that, you can start complaining to the FOI people. The other thing,
and there is it. Sorry.
The other thing about the Section 48 is the 14 days, right? So if they say no, or if they don't respond in 40 days to your Section 48, you can now go to the AAT, right? So what happens is that if you go on the NDIS website, it will say that you can't take your complaint to the next level, because that's asking them to make a decision or to rule on a decision that hasn't been made.
Yeah.
Right? They can't review a review that hasn't been done.
Right. Okay.
Which they are correct about. But what they are not correct about is the general rules of the AAT say that the AAT can look at any administrative process run by any government agency and make decisions about it. So the law actually says that they're supposed to do these Section 48 reviews as soon as possible. Nobody will tell you what as soon as possible means, but you can go on the A4 website and you will find email correspondence that I have with the AAT. You don't have to do this by any means, but it's just that the evidence is there, where I've said that, you know, having anything longer than 4 weeks for a young autistic child is not as soon as is reasonably possible.
Yeah.
It's not reasonable to extend it beyond that. And they've pretty much accepted that.
Okay.
So if your review takes, I mean, 4 weeks is really the lower limit, but if it goes beyond 8 weeks, you can go to the AAT and say they have not done the review in a reasonable amount of time. Okay, so it's not the internal NDIS process that you're dealing with at that point. It's really going to the next step of the process and saying we're now going to push you along by having external reviewers involved. So I encourage people to not accept these indefinite delays, is to engage with the AAT at that point. If you haven't had your satisfaction from them reasonably quickly, you introduce yourself to the AAT and let the NDIS know that you're prepared to go there and say, we need this sorted out as quickly as possible so that we can move on. Okay. So there are two areas there in the process. If they decide that they're not going to do a review, okay. I mean, if they were to turn around and say there's not a change in circumstance and we're not going to do a review, in my case, I'd be going, well, that's not even the law, right? I'd be going to the AAT and saying they're making a decision that's way outside the law here, right? There is nothing in the law about change in circumstance. Okay, I've requested a review. Generally, it's good to give some reasons for doing that, but the reasons maybe they haven't understood you or they've disregarded something. But you can go to them and say, look, I really want this review, and I've never heard of the AAT saying no. They've always said, in my experience, and I think the only case that would arise is if you've done this several times before and it's gone nowhere, and they're starting to think you're being vexatious.
Right? Got it.
So other than that, I think the AAT is going to say to the NDIS, come on, you've got to do the review. And then they're going to do it relatively quickly. Right.
Okay.
And then if
Bob, how long would you wait, Bob? How long would you, if it was you, how long would you wait?
Maximum 8 weeks for a review. So there's 2 weeks to decide they're going to do it. Right. And if you haven't heard that they're going to do it, right, then I'd be going to the AAT. So that's after 2 weeks. If they have said they're going to do it, or if they've been told they have to do it, and it then hasn't happened in another 8 weeks, I would be going to the AAT and saying it hasn't been done as soon as is reasonable, right? Which is what the Section 48 requires. And I think that probably applies. Even if you make a Section 100 request, you could probably invoke that in relation to a Section 100 request.
Yeah, they did it. I think that's what drove the 90 days, because they about in January or something last year, someone did go to the AAT. I think they had been waiting 6 months for their review outcome, but I think they actually publicly stated, it still probably says somewhere that they're attempting to do them all within 90 days. But
I'm sure they are. But I think in the case of children, you can actually push it harder. And I think you should push it harder.
I was just going to say, like, there's a lot, it sounds really complicated when you start tying it into all of the different components of the legislation, because the legislation is quite long and detailed. But I think kind of the main, the main things for people to be aware of is that you can request a review at any time, and that is supported in the legislation. Once you make your request, the NDIS technically has 14 days to say yes or no. We're either going to review your plan or we're going to say no, we're going to deny your request. Now, Alex has noted in the chat that one of her clients was told by the NDIA that it was the time once the request has been acknowledged by the NDIA, not from when you actually make the request. Do you have you ever heard of that before?
That's how. So they're saying, Bob, that if you submit the request and no one looks at that email for 2 weeks, and that 14 days that they have starts from the time when they look at the email.
Rubbish. It was submitted in April.
Yeah, it's rubbish. Yeah, we've heard that a lot in the last month, and it's just not true. So they should go back and quote the section of the legislation that says 14 days. And
so yes, the legislation supports the 14 days from when you submit the request. They are obligated to do their job and look at their emails and make sure that they're actioning things in a timely manner. So again, if families are having difficulty getting responses within these windows, getting their requests acknowledged, as frustrating as it sounds, it really is that consistency with being a squeaky wheel and going back and following up and citing the relevant part of the legislation that supports what it is that you're trying to do and trying to achieve. So, you know, in essentially, if you make your request and either they never respond to you they don't respond to you within that 14-day window, or they come back to you and say, no, we're going to deny your request for a review. What that means is that you then take it external to the NTIS and you put in what's called a review through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, or the AAT, which is an independent panel external to the NDIS, which we'll talk about at our last webinar in 3 weeks. But essentially, if you say that that's the direction that you're going to go in because you're not getting a timely response or a suitable outcome, then sometimes that can help get things happening a bit quicker and get a bit more responsiveness. And it's unfortunate that that's how it is right now, but I think what we've all experienced in supporting families is that that tends to be pretty effective. And using those pathways in that way is what it's meant to do. It's set up that way for a reason, so you can use it, so you can get the response that you need. So I think that's kind of a general overview of like the pathways that you can go down. Go ahead, Bob.
Shannon brought up a family who did an FOI request.
Yeah.
I'd just like to make a quick comment that at this stage, I wouldn't actually do that, okay? It delays you that 30 days, right? And if you need it, it happens fairly automatically in the next part of the process. So, I mean, if you're going to do it by all means, but don't wait for it, would be my advice.
Okay.
Yeah, so, and there is the NDIA, I think they must have been getting a lot of FOI requests, because there is a request for participant information that you can do via the NDIA website that does seem to come back a little bit faster than a typical FOI request that you would do through any government department. But that depends on how much funding you have and how quickly you need the change too. Because I agree, Bob, if you've got $10,000 and that's going to last you not very long at all, then you don't wait any time at all to request a review. Good point.
Yeah, you can do it in parallel, is I guess the point. So you put in your request and you get the process going.
Yeah.
But if you really want that information, be aware that when you need it, it becomes available anyway.
Right.
That's the next part of the process.
Gotcha.
And yeah, I sort of wouldn't spend too much energy on that. I'd be focusing on getting the things that you need to do for that review done.
Yeah, gotcha. Makes sense. Well, we've talked quite a bit about the sort of process and technicalities, but Vicky, I'll turn it over to you. It would be great if you could share a little bit about what your experience was like as a parent actually going through this process. And granted, I don't know if you've been through it more than once, and it may have been earlier days, but what was it like for you?
We've actually submitted 3 internal reviews.
Oh, wow.
So the outcome for all of them was a significant increase in funding and hours.
So be empowered. Go to review.
definitely worth the time and effort. So in our case, for each of my son's initial planning meetings, I submitted, our provider reports, a support letter from our paediatrician, and a carer statement, covering what my son had achieved through the year, and how these skills had improved his quality of life and social participation. And then what further goals we had and why they were relevant in very practical terms on a day-to-day basis. So just when you're looking at doing a review, a few tips would be to make sure that your goals and what you're asking for aligns with your provider's reports and recommendations.
Yeah.
And I guess make sure that that is worded in a way that the NDIS also understands that your goals and your provider's goals are aligned. Because I have run into this problem once, and I have known other families who have, where the NDIS could not see how, I guess when a provider's report was written in quite technical language and a family's goal was written, I suppose, in more casual language, the NDIS couldn't see how these two were aligned. So definitely check that off. Show how different therapies are developing different skills, because the NDIS can be quite reluctant to fund overlap.
Yeah.
So, for example, just make sure that what your ABA are working on are not the same as what your speech pathologists are working on, not exactly the same. Also, just another sort of tip is that some people have gotten plans that are longer than 12 months. So don't be afraid to ask for it if you think that would work for your family. The worst they can do is say no. You might as well ask for it if you think that would be good for your family. And Bob's already mentioned it, but definitely have a look at your goals. And if you need to review them, just think about whether changing or improving them might better support your child's needs, remembering that the NDIS funding is actually supposed to meet those goals.
Yeah.
Anyway, in our case, for our first review, probably required the most revision because I was brand new to this.
Right.
So I did submit extra stuff. I updated my carer statement. I did all of those things based on advice that I got from an advocate who I contacted, and from other families as well. My second 2, I didn't really need to submit anything extra. So I guess that's also important to note that for 2 reviews, I submitted nothing extra and still got a significant increase in hours. So it seems to me that sometimes this is just a process you have to go through, that you won't get the hours funded that you want unless you go for a review, which, it's not great, but that's kind of the way it is at the moment. And yeah, the final point would just be, as Erin mentioned earlier, start spending the funding from your plan straight away. Spend it, get the therapies in place, start meeting your child's needs. Don't wait. So yeah, that's probably my experience of it.
Can I ask, Vicky, was it in all 3 cases, was it the review was triggered because your plan simply didn't have enough funding?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The initial plans, all 3 of them were ludicrously low. There was no way we were going to meet my son's needs with what was funded.
Yeah, gotcha. And were they long processes, or did they resolve relatively quickly once things had been lodged?
I wouldn't say any of them were quick,
Okay.
but they have gotten quicker. So the first one we went through was a very lengthy process. Lots of phone calls to the NDIS, wasn't really achieving anything with that. And I guess this is probably another tip for families as well. We eventually contacted our local member and said, we need help. We're getting nowhere, and we're running out of funding, and my son needs this. And from the time we contacted our local member, the NDIS called us about 48 hours later.
Okay.
After waiting for months for a call. So that was quite effective for us on that occasion when we did that. The other 2 were quicker. There does seem to be some improvement on that front from the NDIS.
Good. Shannon, have you found the same thing, that the reviews seem to be getting quicker from when this first rolled out?
Yeah, they did definitely. They got quicker, and then it feels like this year they've gotten a little bit slower again. Though I think that they are speeding up a bit. Maybe they've caught up from the original COVID-related things that happened last year.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, I'd say at the moment average about 2 months.
Okay, and would you say that most of your family's plan reviews are triggered just because they don't have enough funding?
Yeah, yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, the plan
common.
doesn't have enough funding. And our reviews at the moment, so where we were seeing this time last year, reviews really result in a lot more funding. It is more common at the moment for them not to do that and to have to go to appeal, which we'll talk about next webinar. But just if you have clients review yourself, didn't get a change in your review outcome, that's pretty typical for what we're seeing at the moment, unfortunately.
But it's also not the last stop.
It's not the last step. It's
more,
just
a
stop on the train, isn't it? It's it's not the last step.
Gotcha. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, the one point I'd add to that is that both Vicky and Shannon are in Victoria. This varies a bit between states.
True.
I'm in New South Wales.
You're right, Bob, actually.
Sorry?
I'm in New South Wales.
Oh, you are, that's right.
Yeah, but I am talking very specifically about Victoria, actually. We have seen some different outcomes in Queensland in the last couple of weeks, and we haven't had a review in New South Wales for a little while.
Yeah. Danielle, next question's for you. From your perspective, working as somebody who's linking families with services and trying to help families navigate, how to spend their funding, have you had any experience with the internal review process, or do you have any recommendations or things families should consider when going through this process?
Yes, so we have been through half a dozen reviews with families over the last 6 months or so. And what we have done have been, we have had that significant change in circumstance, I must admit. One of them was a change in diagnosis, or we identified a change of diagnosis through the therapist or the therapists that were working with the family. So that was a pretty easy change of circumstance review. And we did fill out the paperwork associated, but what we did that really made the difference was use the funding to collect the assessments and reports from some really quality providers that were very good report writers that were supervised, not, a few lines on an email, but identified key areas, were able to describe the needs for the participant, were able to describe what the family needed to improve the capacity of the participant, and also the number of hours multiplied by the types of disciplines that were needed, and all of these different reports that were delivered. And they were everything from an OT report, physio, psychologist, speech therapist, even paediatrician. There was also teachers' aides that put some reports in and things like that, so not just therapists. And they all said exactly the same thing every time. So we had a care planning meeting in each of these cases, and we talked to the family. It was mum and dad usually, and we talked about what was important to their loved one. They'd already worked with the therapists for a while. It didn't have to be too long. And out of that meeting, everyone came out aligned with what the goals were, what they meant for the participant, what was needed going forward. Refined all of the reports over the next couple of months, and then we helped the families put together the change in circumstance review paperwork, which is really just a summary. And I had no previous experience with going through the review process. I just picked up the summaries in each of the different reports and popped them in. So it's actually not that hard. I don't have a therapy background or healthcare background. I'm a commercial person really, but I was able to just pick up some really basic things that were identified, and then the recommendations, and then everyone said however many hours were needed, and that a behaviour support plan was needed, and some behaviour therapies were needed in each of the cases. And of all of the 6, there was a minimum of double the amount of spend, just because we got that really refined detail. One lady, Zara, who was diagnosed, had previously been diagnosed with an intellectual disability, and was diagnosed after a few assessments done with autism. Her plan was multiply by 5 times.
Wow.
Yeah. So she got, well, it was quite small to begin with, if you call it small, but maybe it's not so small, but about 17,000 to like 81,500 or something like that.
Yeah.
Things like, so English was a second language for the family. So there was added layers of complexity there. Really amazing, wonderful family, quite a big family, professional parents, but, you know, it was just so hard to navigate for them. They'd never gone through it before. And they'd been given some other advice. One of the therapists they had been using said that the only solution was drugs for the participant, which didn't quite sound right to me. Not that anyway, we got the therapist together.
It's never the right sole answer.
Well, it didn't feel quite right because they'd been given a bit of an NDIS, so I knew there was something in it. So we explored it a little bit more, and they got behaviour support, OT, psychology, and lots of work to help with the family because she's got lots of siblings, and support worker. Pretty quickly they put into place all of these things, and that participant was able to then go to school every day and in fact catch the bus there and back.
Oh, great.
Yeah, we've seen some amazing outcomes. Young man, 24 years old, he's got cerebral palsy, he's deaf and an intellectual disability. He's been working when he can 3 days a week in a cafe, and that was one of the things that he really wanted. So, you know, what I do know, because people tell me all the time, and I guess I don't have the lived experience, so it's easy for me to say, well, just let's go and do a review.
Yeah.
What I do know is mum and dad or the family members or the participant themselves, it's not that easy to do.
Right.
Like, from an emotional perspective. So I've even had a very close friend of mine just say, you know, stop suggesting I go for a review.
Yeah.
It's not worth the emotional, you know, stress of it all. But I've just seen such amazing outcomes come from it. And I think people think it's a bit more complicated than what it is.
Yeah.
So if I can do it, others can do it. It's just a summary of all those therapies, but it's just making sure there's enough money in the plan to get those assessments and reports. And if you can put aside 6 hours for those, so an hour and a half or so for assessment, a little bit of travel, and then the report writing, and then a supervisor to review that report, that's generally the type of hours you need to put aside for each of those reports. So it does take a bit of work. But you could probably get through with an OT assessment and report, I would imagine. I mean, our cases were really obvious cases to us, families that had a experience the first time. So really it's care planning meaning getting everyone aligned together, 1 hour Zoom meeting, everyone from family members to teachers to whoever will jump online that's relevant, and getting all of the therapists and any report writers' details aligned.
Great. I mean, that's great to hear that your experience has been that those reviews have been successful. Like they've led to good outcomes for the participant and family and better funding, which has allowed them to actually achieve their goals, which is what it's all about. So
yeah.
I think that's been all of our experience, is that using the system works well. And even if it doesn't work well in the first instance, is that there's always another avenue to pursue. And I know many of the service providers within our network at ABIA, many of our ABA service providers will coach. You know, they'll coach families through the process. They'll help provide reports. Many service providers now are getting dedicated staff on board who understand the NDIS and how to navigate the system so that they can assist families. So families should not be afraid to ask for that support when they need it, because even Danielle, who's an entrepreneur, not a therapist, has been able to successfully support families. So that's great. Nishadi, I see you have your hand up. I can just activate your mic if you wanted to say something. Talking permitted. Ask to unmute. I've never done this in the webinar before. Hi.
Hi.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, because my son's, actually I applied for a review, And it's been almost 3 months that, they've sent me a letter saying that they'll call me, but still they haven't called me. So this particular letter was sent about a couple of, maybe about 6 weeks back. So I'm still waiting to, still waiting for their phone call. And I actually called NDIS a couple of times, asking them when are they going to call me back, but they never did. And I was just looking out for, advocates who would really help me in getting more information onto how to get the reviews done, and how to get more support on planning meetings and setting goals, and etc. So yeah, just wanted information on those kind of supports.
Bob, any suggestions?
So technically there are people called disability advocates who are paid to do this. Okay. And one of the things I'd say is that people shouldn't do this on their own. Okay. It's generally a good idea to talk to advocates, or to an advocate.
Okay.
If you can't get in to talk to an advocate, then your service providers may have.
So they're called disability advocates?
Yeah, there's a National Disability Advocacy Program. If you put that into Google, it'll say there's a finder, and if you put your address or your postcode in, it'll tell you all the services that the government funds to provide this service for you for free.
Okay.
Okay, but I will warn you that many of these people are not that good at pushing things through quickly, right? They sort of follow a standard formula which doesn't rock the boat. But I'm much more a boat rocker. I don't like seeing kids' stuff delayed, right? I get stroppy about it. So the other option is that you can get in touch with me personally, and I'll talk through the options with you, and you can decide which ones of those are going to work for you. Okay? So you can either talk to me, you can get a disability advocate, you can talk to your service provider. My suggestion is to try all of those things and find the people who are most helpful for you in this process. Okay?
Yeah, sorry, Nishadi, I put you back on mute because there was some background noise. You're welcome to unmute yourself again. But in our—
thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. In our what do we call it, parent packet that we put together to supplement this webinar series. Well, actually this webinar series supplements our parent packet. In that document, which you can access on the ABIA website, or I believe it'll be sent out with the recording after tonight's presentation, there is a list of or that information about accessing advocacy support is in that parent packet. So the website and some, I guess, just not recommendations. I don't think we can say we can recommend anyone in particular without knowing them, but just possibilities in your area are noted in that packet. So that should help point you in the right direction as well. And so definitely there is support out there to help you navigate this particular part of the process, because it's possible that you'll get different bits of information from different people that you talk to at the NDIS, and it can feel quite confusing. And without kind of having more detailed knowledge of the legislation to fall back on, it's hard to know what the right information is. So feel free also to send an email to our admin team at ABIA, and we can help link you up with additional resources. Go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
thank you.
Just keep looking until you found the support that is helpful for you. I mean, in our case, we found an advocate, and she came around to our house, spoke to me, wrote a support letter, and disappeared. And I did not feel like I understood the process any better at all after she'd been and gone. So we found a second advocate who was amazing. She explained how everything worked. She explained the legislation, what the NDIS were doing, so keep on looking until you've got that person who you think, actually, I get it now and I know what to do.
Great. I've just put up our poll in the last few minutes. If everyone wants to just take a quick second and answer the poll questions, that would be super helpful. But we sort of have gone through, most of the key bits of information that we wanted to get through in tonight's webinar. I'll just open it up, I guess, for general questions. If anybody wants to pop any questions in the chat window or raise your hand, now that I know how to give you your microphone privileges, feel free to just ask away. But I guess I'll just ask the panel one last question, which is, do you have any other tips or strategies or anything you can recommend about the review process that maybe we haven't discussed yet?
I just have one around timing, and I think Bob was saying don't wait for anything. And this is for families also. I know there are lots of families on wait lists at the moment. So if you're looking at intensive services in the future, I wouldn't wait. I would do the review now while you're also waiting for the services. You can do that. So that would be my other tip. And also just to second everything everyone's already said about sort of being dogged about making sure that you get what you need and your child gets what you need. And I think about the NDIS as the whole purpose is for your child or for you to access services so that you need less services in the future. And anything that feels contrary to that probably is. So just keep on going.
Great, thank you. Alex, I'm just grabbing the link to where the resource, the packet, can be found on our website. So I can put that in the chat window. Just give me one quick second. Resources. Online, why is it not here? Oh, here it is. Hang on one second. My computer internet is just being very slow over here.
Erin, while you do that, perhaps I'll just give another top tip.
Go for it.
Feel like you're running out of funding and it's to keep things like OTs, physios going, etc. If you get a really good plan with the OT or physio, for example, you could use a lower cost line item, I'll call it, but professional. It could be like an allied health assistant, or it could even be a support worker to implement the plan just while you go through the review process if you're getting close to, finishing up some of that funding. So OT, for instance, is $193.99 per hour. But you could use, something like a support worker or allied health assistant, but less than $60 an hour. Or if you haven't got the balance quite right among between core and capacity building as well, you haven't got much capacity building left, well, maybe use some of your core with support worker to implement the OT plan and that sort of thing. So there are some ways you can make that money stretch further just while you wait for that review to come around.
Great, good advice. I think that, the main take home point is that from all of our collective experiences, going through this process with families has most of the time yielded a good outcome for families. So don't be afraid to use the process on the grounds that it might be too difficult or an adversarial process. Or, Vicky mentioned going through it twice, just lodging a request and not really even providing any more supplemental information was enough to get the outcome that she was looking for. So it's there for you to use.
Just a quick one, Erin. Somebody else seems to have their hand up.
Oh, sorry, missed you, Sarah. Allowed to talk. All right, Sarah, you should be able to take yourself off mic.
Yep. Hi, I'm Sarah.
Hi.
My question is around what you can ask for in the review. My son, we have a bit of a grey area where some of the goals we want to work on are affecting his everyday life, but also could fall under education. So he's he's having a lot of difficulty with reading and writing. We're not sure why. None of the tests are showing up an intellectual disability. And one of the things that we're noticing is he's now coming up to the age of 11, still can't read and write, and we want to start implementing processes for him to learn how to use technology to get around those disadvantages of not being able to read and write. And I was just wondering if anyone has any tips or any suggestions on how we can go about that in the review process, because we've just run out of funding, about 3 months short of the end of the plan.
I mean, my best advice is framing the skills that you want him to work on as functional life skills and not just academic skills. So being able to read is such a critical life skill at school and outside of school for so many different reasons. For him to be independent, access the community, be able to go do everything, you know, as independently as possible in the big wide world. As well, it's expected that schools deliver sort of the general curriculum with some reasonable accommodations to help students access the general curriculum. But it sounds like the types of accommodations that your son needs exceed what many schools might consider a reasonable accommodation. I don't agree with that. I think that they should provide the right supports at school, but I think that you have a compelling case that these are not supports that he's to date received at school. They are critical functional life skills, and that the NDIS is appropriate body to fund the types of specialist support that he will need to start to learn those skills and be able to demonstrate progress. Go ahead, Bob.
I think you've got to come at this from 3 angles, actually. One is I'd be calling up the NDIS and say, we've run out of money, put some more in, number one, and do that now, right? Because he obviously needs it. Having no money is not a good situation for any child with a disability. So it's reasonable to expect that they're going to top that up at this stage if you've actually run out, number one. Then there's the review process that says it needs to be really accommodated in the plan. And that's what Erin was just talking about is you need to phrase it as general life skills to some extent. But I think you also need to put pressure on education and say, this is, you know, my child has been sent to your school so far for 6 or something years. And the basic literacy and numeracy goals are not being achieved. What are you going to do to fix that? I think the NDIS reasonably has an argument that those things ought to be addressed in that space. But I'd be, from your personal position, I'd be going after all of those, right? Rather than sort of putting one first. So it's a big ask, but if you can do it, attack it from different angles and take whatever you get from any of those angles.
That sounds like the process that we have started to initiate. The school has come to the conclusion with us that this isn't acceptable and how do we move forward with this. And I feel comfortable with how they're approaching it under the circumstances. They're finding it quite challenging due to the fact that he's not testing for dyslexia or intellectual disability. So there's the not being able to put him in a box has been probably one of our biggest stumbling blocks in the process. With the NDIS, I suppose that it's been nice to have it confirmed that I am on the right track. The thing that my focus has been on is around those community skills, things like, okay, he's 11, he should be able to go into the supermarket and be able to, find some milk and know, and to be able to, find out the price of things or look at a menu when we're out as a family. So the things that we've been looking at that is, how do we use devices to read for him? How do we help him navigate the process of perhaps starting to think about public transport because he'll start high school in the next year. How does he navigate being able to go to a library on his own? What are those life skills that incorporate that reading and writing that we need to not just be able to help him read and write, but how does he find that through, how does he navigate that through the community? So yeah, no, that's, thank you for that. I appreciate your feedback.
Yeah, no, and if you're able to get more funding to work on those functional life skills that have an element of academic skills, reading, money, maths built into them, then there's no reason that you can't work with your therapy team and your support worker, or your therapist, to actually work on those academic skills in the context of the therapy as they are building blocks to getting to those larger functional skills. So I think, yeah, as long as you can phrase it in your request as more towards the life skills, and if there are any interfering behaviors that are making it tricky for him to fully participate in certain types of academic instruction, that would also be good to note. And then you can incorporate it all within your the support that you're receiving. But great that you've been able to chat with the school about getting on the same page and have them pick up their end of the ball as well. That's really important.
Just another quick suggestion. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but homework is a home-based life skill. So I've certainly heard of families who have looked for support workers who might have a teaching background to support the family with homework in the afternoons. And that may also be something that could be helpful.
Yeah, so good options. I like Bob's idea of pursuing it from all angles. But like we said, if you feel like you are kind of needing some additional support with the process, feel free to check out our packet or email us at ABIA to get some sort of additional directions and resources. So I think that's about it for tonight. Not next week, in 3 weeks, when we have our final webinar, we're going to be discussing what to do if your internal review doesn't produce the outcome you're looking for, and you actually have to go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and take it that external review process. So that's what our 6th and final webinar in the series will be all about. So we hope you can join us for that in 3 weeks. And I'll give you a little spoiler. The AAT process is not as nearly as scary as it sounds. And so we hope you can join us, and tell anyone who might be interested in this topic that all of these webinars are video recorded and are housed on the ABIA website. So they're accessible to anybody who couldn't make it to the live event. But thank you all so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Have a good night, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.